As I shared earlier, our week of Vacation Bible School has as its title, Deep Sea Discovery. That's the fun-filled adventure setting of our Bible school. Pretending that we are in some big aquarium or sea park or some science discovery location where we can learn a lot, experience a lot about what life is like in the sea. Now that's not really the focus, that's the setting. And the song we just sang, I sing the mighty power of God that made the mountains rise, that spread the flowing seas abroad and built the lofty skies. Even that theme is going to serve to hopefully help children and adults be reminded of this God who created this amazing world. And we're going to learn some amazing things about creatures in the sea along with our Bible theme. But our Bible theme, as I mentioned, is not directly about the sea, but interestingly, it's addressed in this song we just sang as well. The last verse, and everywhere that man can be, thou God art present there. God is with me wherever I go. The simple theme. It's nice and child size. Easy to understand. And yet I want to suggest that we never outgrow its relevance. This theme served as the inspiration for my message this morning. Only my title and my theme are the same. I don't have a catchy context for us to play in. My title is simply God's persistent presence, and that's my theme. When we talk about the presence of God, we're talking about the reality of God being with us. We're talking about the reality of God being in close proximity to us, but it's not simply about space. It's not simply about being in the same room or being in the same town. It's not ultimately about that, although we say that God is everywhere. It's not restricting God to a specific location or even expanding God to a specific location. But rather it goes beyond that and carries the idea of God being fully aware and fully within reach. I want to say those again just to help us get our mind around them. We're not just talking about a presence of location. When we're talking about God being with us, God's presence with us, it carries and includes the idea of God being fully aware and fully within reach. In other words, that He knows all about us at any given moment. He's fully aware. He is with us. He knows all about us at any given moment. We are within reach of Him. What do we mean by reach? Well, we usually think of the length of an arm, right? If something's within reach, it's close enough. We don't even have to take a step. We just reach and there it is. That's God's presence. So we are within reach of Him. Scripture talks about God's arm is not short, that He can't save. Wherever we are within His reach. And also that He is within reach of us. So don't just think physically. Don't just think location, but think beyond that. Think of God's awareness of us at all times. Think of us being within His reach and His being within our reach. in Romans chapter 10, the Apostle Paul wrote kind of about this concept. I'm not going to read all of this, but I want to turn there just for a moment at this juncture. In Romans chapter 10, Paul raises the question about kind of how do we make a connection with God? I'm going to pick this up in verse 6, and I know we're not going to get the context here, but I'll hopefully give enough that this makes sense to you. Paul writes, Romans 10, verse 6, but the righteousness that is by faith says, and now he's quoting, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the deep, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. He's saying, our faith teaches us we don't have to say those things. We don't have to worry about how can I get God's attention? How can I somehow bring this God who's far away and convince him to come near? How can I get up to where he is and bring him down to me? How can I reach into the grave and bring him up? He says, we don't have to do that. He says, but what does it say? And again he quotes, the word is near you, it is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith we are proclaiming. He's saying it's not even a matter of God being within arm's length. Where does he say God is? He says God is as close as the word in our mouth and in our heart. The word of faith that we are proclaiming. He goes on to say that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And there's a bigger context there that we can explore another day. But in terms of God's presence with us, doesn't matter if you're in this country, it doesn't matter if you're in another country, it doesn't matter what the circumstance, he's as close as calling out to him. That's the presence that we're talking about. I've used another term in my title, the term persistent. And that's on purpose too, because as we look through the scriptures, we find that God's kind of stubborn about his presence. I actually thought of using that in the title, God's stubborn presence. Does that work too? You ever think about God being stubborn? Now, we often use that in a negative context, don't we? But stubborn, persistent, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it? God is stubborn about a lot of things. He's stubborn about his love for us. He's stubborn about his presence with us. And as we read earlier from Psalm 139 in our call to worship, there's no place we can go to get away from his presence. It just can't happen. And it's not only a presence that's checking up on us. It's not just the children's song that says, oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little ears, what you hear. Be careful, little hands, what you do. Little feet, where you go. For the Father up above is looking down in love. It's not just okay, he's present to try to catch us doing something wrong. He cares about us. He cares about everything that we do. But it's not persistent for the purpose just of catching us. It's persistent from a God who created us, who loves us more than we can imagine, who wants the best for us, who wants us to be in relationship with him, who wants us to be aware of his presence, to practice his presence, as an author wrote years ago. He wants us to live out his presence. He wants that to become a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute part of our life, that we know that we are walking through life in relationship with him, that he is as close as the words in our mouth, as close as the mention of his name, a songwriter once wrote. That his awareness of us is full and complete at all times. We are always within his reach. He is always within our reach and longs for us to turn to him. The psalm that we read again from Psalm 139. isn't just talking about locations. It starts by saying, Lord, you've searched me and know me. You know everything about me. You know when I stand up. You know when I sit down. You know when I travel. You know when I come home. You know it all. At Bible school this week, we're going to be looking at 5 different stories in the Bible. And I just want to mention them this morning, just kind of to draw the rest of you who won't be part of this week, to draw you in to what we're going to be focusing on. But I'm not going to go at length to tell each story this morning, but I'm going to give you kind of my understanding of how that particular story relates to this idea of God's presence with us, that God is with us wherever we go. And I want to give just kind of a category that I believe that story fits into. And as I do, I want you to do the hard work of trying to apply this to your own life. Okay, we're going to start one, and maybe I'll give you a little help and you'll understand what I'm asking for this morning. Day 1, which is today, so 5 o'clock we gather for a picnic and some activity stuff outside, and then maybe 6:15ish or so we'll gather in here for just a time with everyone assembled. We want to have separate classes and all tonight. And in here tonight, we're going to sing some songs. We're going to introduce the theme. We're going to start with our first Bible story. And that Bible story is Noah and the ark. It's a good water story, right? I assume that most of us here this morning know something about that story. The world had become extremely wicked, and God was ready to destroy the whole earth. Now that raises a lot of questions. Not going to give all the answers this morning. The story focuses in on one man named Noah. And Noah was seeking God. Noah's heart was turned towards God. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, the scripture says. Found favor in God's eyes. In the midst of all of this wickedness on the face of the earth, God's presence was such that God knew Noah. God was aware of Noah, fully aware of Noah, fully aware of Noah's heart. God began to orchestrate the rescue of Noah and his family by asking Noah to do a very difficult thing, to build this huge boat. It's going to rescue animals, 2 of every kind, 7 of some, put them in this huge boat that we call an ark, as long as 1.5 football fields, a few stories high. Lori could have a lot of fun just talking about that story. But I want to suggest that the takeaway from that story is that God is present when you find yourself surrounded by tremendous evil. God is present even when you find yourself surrounded by tremendous evil. That was Noah's context. God is present even in that circumstance. God is present to know us, to be fully aware, not only of what's going on out there, but to be fully aware of our heart. He knew Noah's heart, turned towards him. I don't know what circumstances you may have been in at some point in your life where you felt like you were surrounded by tremendous evil and you were all alone. I don't know what circumstances you may yet face where you may feel like you're surrounded by tremendous evil and you're all alone. But I want to remind you that God is present even in that circumstance. He's present, he's aware. You're within his reach, and he's within yours. Monday, we're going to talk about Jonah. God gave Jonah a job to do. I don't think it was nearly as hard as the one that he gave Noah. Well, just hard in a very different way. Noah had to spend 100 years or more building this huge boat without power tools and with his neighbors laughing at him. That was a pretty hard job. All that Jonah had to do was to go to his enemies and preach. Tell them to turn to God. Doesn't sound too hard, does it? But what if God told you to go to your enemy and bring them a message that could save them? Well, maybe you, like Jonah, would rather see your enemies destroyed. So maybe Jonah's task was a little harder than we think. It was so hard, in fact, that Jonah ran the other direction. Found himself on a boat in the sea. A big storm came up, and these unbelieving sailors, I mean, they believed in something. They believed there were some gods out there. They believed that somehow this storm was somebody's fault, and so they were going to cast lots to see whose fault it was, who had done some terrible thing to cause this storm to happen. And, well, long story short, Jonah ended up admitting he was responsible. He knew. He said, God told me to do something, I didn't want to do it, and I'm running away from God, so it's my fault. And I'm not sure at that point even that Jonah was really repentant, or if he just thought, I'd rather die than go preach to Nineveh, those Assyrians. We're not sure all that was in Jonah's heart, but he said, throw me overboard and the storm will stop. And they threw him overboard and the storm stopped. And I would imagine Jonah expected to die. It's a fabulous story. There Jonah is in the water. Along comes this big fish or whale, whatever it was, and next thing we know, there's Jonah inside. Air pocket. I know some people say it couldn't possibly happen. There's been other studies that say actually maybe it could. As this story unfolds, there Jonah is in the belly of this whale. I'm sure there's no cell phone service there. But God was there. God heard Jonah when Jonah prayed from the depths of the sea in the belly of a whale. See, God's presence, God is fully aware. God is always within reach of us. We're always within reach of Him. He hears us. Even in the midst of our greatest failures. I want to say that again. God is present even in the midst of our greatest failures. Because that was Jonah's context. Now, I don't imagine any of you have experienced any failures in your life. I have. It's good to know that God is present in the midst of our greatest failures. Doesn't matter where we are, He's as close as the words from our mouth. He hears our prayers. He forgives. He restores. It's good to know. I don't know what all failures have been in your past. I don't know what all failures may be in your future. But even then, God is present. He's aware. He's within reach. Our third day, we move forward to Peter. Another great story. There the disciples are in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. A storm comes up, and they're fearing for their lives. And then they see this figure walking across the water. You heard what I said, walking on top of the water. I'm not going to try to explain it. For a moment, they got even more afraid. until they heard a familiar voice say, "Don't be afraid, it's me." And they recognized it as the voice of Jesus. And then Peter, impetuous Peter, had such a surge of faith and encouragement, and he hollers out, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come and I'll come to you." And Jesus says, "Come." And Peter steps out of the boat and begins to walk towards Jesus. Now, you know the rest of the story. He then got looking around him and saw the wind of the waves, and kind of like a child trying to learn to ride a bike, you know. You make a couple turns, and then you look, and then all of a sudden it starts wobbling, and then you're down. Now, I'm not saying walking on water is as easy as riding a bike. Don't misunderstand me this morning. But interesting, I don't know how far it was from where Peter was to where Jesus was. You understand they couldn't. I mean, I know there's a lot of storm. You understand they could see a figure, but they didn't recognize him. And this always kind of puzzled me, the thought of, okay, well, how many steps had Peter taken before he began to sink? Was he really this far from Jesus and he began to sink? I always kind of assumed that at some level, because it says that Peter began to sink and he cried out, "Lord, save me," and Jesus reached down and pulled him back up. When we think about God's presence with us, fully aware, fully within reach, Jesus could have been 50 yards away. But still as close as the words from Peter's mouth. "Lord, save me." And in that instant, within reach, God's presence. What's the principle here? God is present when you find yourself assailed by overwhelming wind and waves. Nobody can relate to that this morning. God is present when you find yourself assailed by overwhelming wind and waves. Those winds and waves take all different forms. I could look out this morning and a lot of those different forms I see as I see your face. And I know what many of you have been through. I don't know what's ahead. But I don't think the storms are going to stop today. I think there's going to be some really rough storms ahead for some of us. I don't know who, I don't know what. But what I do know is that God is present when we find ourselves assailed by overwhelming wind and waves. He is present, and He can strengthen us in the midst of those storms. He can raise us to a firm footing. He can sustain us. He is present, He is aware, He is within reach. Day 4 comes from John 21. After the crucifixion, some of the disciples have seen Jesus, but things are still different. He's not there with them. He made an appearance in the upper room, and a few saw him that Easter Sunday morning, but there was still a whole lot of what I would call crippling uncertainty about the future. So much so that Peter and some of the others, Peter, I think, said, guys, I don't know what's happening here. I'm going to go get my boat. I'm going to go back to fishing. And so they went back out. And Jesus was there on the shore. And even though this had happened before, they still didn't recognize him when he said, "Hey, how's the fishing been?" Been all night. Haven't caught anything. Try the other side. The other side of the lake? No, the other side of the boat. Throw your net off the other side. And they did. The net's about broke for the catch of fish. Finally, Peter says, "Oh, this is too familiar. I think I know what's going on here." Well, no, he threw off his cloak, he jumped in the water, and he said, "It's Jesus." He starts swimming for shore. And there on the shore, Jesus kind of reaffirms his love and care for his disciples. There's other things going on in this story. But he kind of reaffirms that his plan hasn't changed. He still has called them to be fishers of men, not fishers of fish. And that hasn't changed. And the fact that they got scared and ran hasn't changed anything. The fact that Peter had denied that he knew him hasn't changed anything. That he still had a plan and purpose for them. And I'm going to broaden that to a principle that simply says God is present when you feel crippling uncertainty about the future. I know some of you have been there. I know others of you will be. Just know that God is present, that he is aware, and he's within reach. The last day, appropriately so, is about going out. Talks about Paul and his missionary journeys, how he was sent. He was sent to tell the world the message of Christ. And he had journeys on the sea. He had shipwreck. He went through a lot of difficult times. But the reminder is that God is with us when he sends us. There's no place he sends us that he is not aware and that he is not within reach. Whether it be the neighbor down the street, whether it be a family member, whether it be a friend, whether it be Paris Island in boot camp, whether it be in Thailand, whether it be in Puerto Rico, where our young people were recently, whether it was in South Dakota, where Donna was recently with some other young people, wherever we go, there's no place, no circumstance into which God sends us that he is not there, aware and within reach. He made it a special point about this one, to tell his disciples, "I'm sending you into the world. Go and make disciples of all people, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I've taught you. And remember this, I'm always with you to the very end." I don't know where all God has asked you to go, what all God has asked you to do that you may have felt terrified. You may have felt, "No, I can't do that." I'm not sure what all God's going to ask you in the future. But I do know that whenever that call comes, and wherever that call leads you, that God is fully aware. God is within reach. And may we be encouraged by this simple truth. God is with me wherever I go.